Thanks so much, Mark. It's always a profound joy to be here and to practice and learn with all of you. Thanks for joining us today. And of course, I think we're all aware that we're now approaching Rosh Hashanah. And I wanted to provide us today with a little bit of practice and preparation for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And today's session is titled Seeing Through the Eyes of Love. I know it's certainly true for me that sometimes as I come into this season of Teshuvah during the month of Elul and then into the high holidays, that actually I tend to see myself through the eyes of judgment, reviewing all of my mistakes and mindless errors, and the ways in which I've fallen short over the course of the year with myself, with my family members, with my community, with my colleagues. And, I want to suggest that there's a different stance we can take as we come into this season that may be more constructive in our process of Teshuvah, and that is actually witnessing or seeing through the eyes of love. And to invite us into that, we're going to turn to some text study, and my good friend here, Natalie, is going to pull up the source sheet for today. You can also find a direct link to it if it's easier for you to enlarge it or have it available to you, not on the screen in this particular format. You can always print it up as well and come back to it at a later time. But I want to begin actually with just some brief lines from the Unetane Tokef prayer, which is so central to the high holiday liturgy of both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Of course, this is a German piyut, a German liturgical poem that was composed in the Middle Ages. I won't get into the story about how it was composed. It's quite a profoundly moving story, but I just love these lines here. And I broke them up into kind of two chunks because I want to show contrast here. So we acknowledge in this prayer that we come from dust and we return to dust, and that we bring forth our bread by our very being, which is that we basically dedicate all of our energy and our life force in this life, our very nefesh. The Hebrew is nefesh, right? To as it were, bringing home the vegetarian bacon, as it were. That really preoccupies us, and perhaps keeps us from contemplating the nature of this human experience. And so the poet goes on to say that we are likened to a broken shard, Gecheres Hanishbar, withering grass, Chatzir Yavesh, a fading flower, Tzitz Novel, and so on and so forth, a passing shadow, a dissipating cloud, a blowing wind, floating dust, and a fleeting dream, right? And this is one of the insights that we gain in practice when we observe our moment-to-moment experience, right? Of course, we know on a macro level that everything is changing, everything is impermanent, but in practice, we begin to actually witness that process happening on a micro level, moment by moment. We can see that the body, the heart, the mind, right? These are all impermanent, changing every single moment of our lives. And of course, all leading up to the time when finally, we will encounter the moment of our death. But then the poet goes on to contrast our changing nature with the eternal nature of the divine, saying, but you, God, are the living and eternal majestic one. There is no limit to your years and no end to the length of your days. So this is our way of talking about going for refuge for those of you who may have a Buddhist kind of background, right? This is how we talk about going for refuge, which is to say, this life is impermanent. There's really nothing that's truly dependable in this life because everything is changing. Everything is changing, right? Our relationships are always changing. The things that we might buy, to try and get a sense of stability. Those are changing. Eventually they break or they fall apart, right? Or they fall into disrepair. Our bank accounts are always changing. The stock market is always changing. There's really nowhere where we can go for absolute refuge, right? A place where we can find true stability. But the poet here says we can go to God, right? We can take refuge in the divine because God is never changing. God's very nature is to be eternal, not subject to fluctuation or change. And God transcends, as it were, time and the ravages of time. Okay. Now, in a kind of exoteric traditional understanding, right, the divine is out there, right, beyond the world. But if we begin to take a look at Maimonides here, and Natalie, if you could scroll up a little, actually, we'll take a look at the English, right? But I just want to see people to see the title so they know where this text is from. Next text is from Maimonides, who lived from 1135 to 1204. He's a Sephardic sage and philosopher, and some people don't realize this, but he also was a contemplative. And in his Guide for the Perplexed, he teaches actually that, when we go for that kind of a refuge, we actually can find it inside of ourselves. We don't have to look beyond ourselves. We can find it inside of ourselves. Here's what he has to say. We do not sit, move, or occupy ourselves when we are home alone in the same manner as we do in the presence of a great king. Right? Maybe at home, we walk around in our underwear, or we say whatever we want, whatever's on our mind, but we don't do that when we're in the presence of royalty, right? And he goes on to say in the next paragraph, therefore, if we desire to attain human perfection and become people of God, we must awake from our spiritual sleep and know that the great king or queen, right? Or the majestic one, I like in English as a translation for melech, who hovers over us and adheres, that's the word there is davek, like glue, dvekut, or devek, adheres to us always, is greater than any earthly king, greater than even David and Solomon, the greatest kings the Jewish people ever had. The majestic one who adheres and hovers over us is the very consciousness that rests upon us, which is itself the connection between us and the divine. So Maimonides says you want to find that refuge from all of the changing circumstances of life, right? Look deeply inside of yourself. Look to your own consciousness, your own awareness. And if you can actually really kind of pay attention and cleave to, as it were, right, like glue, really fix your attention on that part of yourself, you will have discovered the divine. And he goes on to say, just as we have perceived God by means of the light that God bestowed upon us, wherefore the psalmist says, in your light we see light. So we can see directly, we can experience directly that we are conscious, and we can connect with this light of awareness, right? When we talk about the light of awareness, it doesn't mean that there's some sort of literal physical light shining in your mind or in your being. It's that the light of awareness has this capacity to illuminate whatever is in front of it, right? To recognize this is the way it is. This is the way it is. So just as we perceive God by looking to awareness itself, we might say awareness is the window through which we behold God. Wherefore the psalmist says, in your light, we see light, right? In God's light, we have the capacity to then witness the divine light that's shining upon us. So does God observe us through that very same light, being with us always, observing and seeing us on account of this light. In other words, the window through which we see God is the very window through which God witnesses or sees us. And then he adds from Jeremiah, can anyone hide in secret places that I shall not see them? And he invites us to understand this deeply, not just as an idea, but to contemplate it, to experience it directly. So here we have a very interesting orientation to both what it means to discover the divine refuge that's never changing in awareness itself, which is to say, right, the witness inside of us, right? Our physical sensations that we witness, the emotions we witness, the thoughts we witness, the world that we witness, those things are always changing. There's no real reliable sanctuary or refuge there. But if we become aware of the witness and actually turn our attention toward the witness and witness the witness itself, where we can discover this true refuge, this place inside of us that's unchanging, that is divine. And then he adds, right, it's through that very same window that we might perceive the divine, that God looks upon or perceives us. In other words, God isn't looking at us from somewhere up in heaven. Right? We're not talking about the old man in the sky here. This is a different theological paradigm, right? God is conscious, a field of infinite consciousness, and that field of infinite consciousness is looking at you through your own awareness. It's witnessing everything you say, do, think, and so on and so forth through your own awareness. Right? In terms of how we relate to this awareness, the mystics, the Jewish mystics say it's not just conscious, right? It's not just aware, this infinite consciousness, but it's actually also made of love. It's a loving awareness. And so that when God witnesses us, right, God looks upon us with the eyes of love through the window of our own awareness. Right? And that's no matter what it is that we're thinking, feeling, saying, acting, right? However we are, however we show up in the world, whether we're experiencing malicious thoughts or loving thoughts, right? Or anger or generosity, or whether our bodies are engaging in a way that's wholesome and helpful, hugging other people, or pushing other people away, or maybe causing harm in some way, right? Through our speech or through our action, right? God is always there witnessing us and witnessing us with the eyes of love, waiting for us to return, right? To come back into a path of alignment that will help us to more deeply attune to and become more resonant with the loving awareness, the divine loving awareness at the heart of our being. So this helps us to develop a theology of mindfulness in our tradition, right? In which when we observe our own experience lovingly and compassionately, as we do in mindfulness practice, what we are doing is participating in the divine process of witnessing everything that we're experiencing with the eyes of love and compassion. So let's actually do that instead of just talking about it. And we can take down the screen share now. Okay. So let's find a posture that feels like it helps us to sit relatively still. Of course, we may need to move if there's pain in the body or discomfort, but we can always do so mindfully. And we try to set ourselves up to be comfortable, to be grounded. So however your body needs to sit, right, to be somewhat relaxed, pliant, and also alert and awake. That'll do the trick. Only you know your body. And right here and right now, let's just take 3 really deep breaths, allowing the breath to fill the rib cage, the solar plexus, even the abdomen. Right? Allow the abdomen to just be completely loose and open and wide as you take an in-breath. And then as you breathe out, allow the abdomen to empty. Breathe out all the way up to your collarbones if you can. And then as you breathe in all the way down from the collarbones down to the belly, and then vice versa. And just witness the breath. Observe the breath. Of course, as we breathe like this, we might begin to notice there is this finite, changing, embodied experience of breathing. But there's also the luminous awareness or consciousness that knows that breathing is happening, isn't there? And the breathing is changing, but the awareness itself, it precedes the breath, doesn't it? It's already there to meet the breath when the breath arrives. And it's there throughout the breath, isn't it? And even when the breath ceases, say, and out breath comes to a conclusion, awareness doesn't just disappear, does it? It outlives or outlasts the finite breath. Don't take my word for it. Check it out for yourself. And as Maimonides taught us, this awareness rises above the fray. It's not caught up or co-opted into the current of change. It stands above as witness, as observer. And we can also notice how this awareness meets whatever arises and allows it to be there unconditionally. It allows it to move through. In this regard, it's loving. It doesn't say this breath is allowed in, but this other breath needs to stay outside. Or this thought is permitted, but this other thought is prohibited. It's open and spacious like space. Just like the wide open sky allows clouds to move through without discriminating, awareness allows whatever we're experiencing in thought, emotion, or body, and even world to just arise and be known and move through. Of course, if the breath doesn't feel like a safe home base, you can instead notice sounds, or even just watch thoughts arising and moving through the space of the mind and then dissolving. Okay, and now just notice what happens if you inclined your own mind toward being a vessel, a window through which God is perceiving you and the world. What happens when you imagine a consciousness that is literally infinite, looking in upon you through the window of your own awareness? Just notice if anything shifts in body, heart, or mind as you do that. What happens if you imagine that this divine witness is beholding you with the eyes of infinite love and compassion? Every part of you, the pleasant sensations and the unpleasant sensations, the open, loving heart and the contracted, defensive heart. The mind that may be full of malice and the mind that's full of peace. All the hatred, the greed, the delusion, as well as all of the love, generosity, and wisdom. We've never been alone. We've always been seen and held in the embrace of unconditional love. So when you hold this kind of an awareness in heart and mind, how might it then support you to practice self-compassion or self-forgiveness for the mistakes that you've made, for the misdeeds you've committed? Let's sit just for another 30 seconds, and then Mark will take us out with the sound of the shofar.
Sam, thank you so much, as always, for guiding us so beautifully. And friends, let's seal this practice today, offering an opportunity for those of you who are in mourning, observing your site, or if it's your custom to join them when Kaddish, you're welcome to do so. If you're not reciting Kaddish, we invite you to stay present, please, for those who are, to offer your compassion and support in their time of loss. And you can put the name or names of anyone you're honoring today in the chat now, or after you recite Kaddish. And if you're joining me, please rise in body or in spirit, and you can unmute at this time. Yitkadal,
Amamin Kogir Hatavashir, Miran Amavinata, Damiram, the Arlam, Rama, Mr. Shalom,
Shalama Rabam Shemaya.
Friends, thanks so much for joining us today. As always, I want to thank Natalie Rushinoff for holding our tech space today. And we want to thank Ruth Feldman for sponsoring the beautiful practice today in loving memory of her dad, Morton Feinberg, and her mom, and her brother, Aaron. Ruth, thank you so much. And again, may their memories be a source of blessing and light in your life and through our practice today in this world. And of course, much gratitude to my dear friend and colleague and teacher, Rabbi Sam Feinsmith, for this gorgeous teaching today. I'm looking forward to having another 15 minutes to explore it with him. You're always welcome to use this time to continue just to sit with your own practice. If you like, you can turn the sound off on your computer and just use the container of our community to hold this space for you if you'd like to stay with that. Or you can join us for conversation. You can share in the chat any reflections you had in your experience. If you have a question we'd like to put to Sam, please add that to the chat and preface it by writing question all in caps, and I'll try to work your question into our conversation. Sam, that was really special. Thank you so much for beginning our week with such a powerful practice today. And I guess I want to, there's so much there. And there are some things that I feel like really deserve to be highlighted or underscored in some way. And they're like, there's a lot of gems here. One of which is, how you handle the translation of the Hebrew word melech, which means king, and is one of the primary themes, particularly of Rosh Hashanah, Malchuyot, kingship, divine sovereignty, which is a challenging metaphor for a lot of people. And I think it was very helpful, just your simple translation of majestic one, maybe can be of great assistance, I think, for a lot of people in dealing with that. So I want to just, number one, underscore that and reiterate it. I thought that was great. Or even just majesty as a word. I'm curious whether that helps that metaphor work more effectively for people. And the other really is the main, your main point from Unatana Toka and from the Rambam here is the idea of awareness and consciousness itself. I think seichel is the word in the Hebrew word that's used there as our actual lived experience of connection with the divine. I think part of why, I think it's really a great opportunity for us to talk here a little bit about why this is a spiritual and, dare say, religious practice, not just a secular mindfulness practice of grounding ourselves, but actual connection with the divine through the gift of our own consciousness and awareness. So I'm just going to reflect back to you the teaching as I hear it and invite you to elaborate on it, and maybe people want to refine it in the chat. But what I hear you suggesting is that we're all equipped with awareness and awareness of being aware, right? And the suggestion, the invitation is to consider that actually not just as like my awareness, but that of awareness itself, which undergirds and is within and beneath and deeper than everything, is showing up within us, that we experience as our awareness, but actually is a much broader infinite awareness. And Maimonides is basically saying that consciousness both hovers over us and adheres to us, like where it's in our awareness, but it's not synonymous with it. In other words, my awareness is not God's awareness or divine awareness. Divine awareness is that bigger field that my awareness is part and parcel of and inextricable from, and much bigger than mine. And that therefore I can be aware that I am a window, and I also can be aware that the divine is, as it were, looking through my window into me in some way. Yes? How's
Yeah,
that?
that's accurate. That's accurate. And just to help clarify a little bit more, um, the distinction between my awareness and awareness itself, right?
Hmm.
I love this metaphor that the rabbis use in describing how it was that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, which is infinite, right, how it could fill um, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, or the temple in Jerusalem, and they provide this beautiful parable, comparing the Shekhinah to the ocean. And imagine there's a cave adjacent to the ocean, right? And the water of the ocean is flowing into and filling up the cave, right, with water. So on the one hand, the water in the cave takes on the shape and contours of the walls of the cave, right, the floor of the cave, and so on and so forth, right? But the ocean isn't diminished one bit, right? So if you imagine each of us as that cave, right, this infinite consciousness fills us, but when it's inside each one of us and our finite being, it takes on the shape of our finite being, right? And what that shape looks like is there's a subject in here who is apart from, right, disparate from everything else out there, right, which I designate as an object, right? In other words, we fall into dualistic consciousness, right? And we come to believe in an inherent self-existent self in here, right? A subjective self beholding an objective world. When we turn awareness, or when I turn awareness, I should speak of my own experience. Perhaps your experience is different. Right? When I turn my awareness back toward itself to look upon itself, right? It's as if my awareness goes through the entryway to the cave and returns back to the ocean, which of course it was never separate from at all, because it's all the same water. And the ocean itself was never diminished one drop, even though the water entered temporarily into the cave, right? And when that happens, the subject object divide falls away and there's just awareness, right? That's all that
You stay there, stay with that for a second, okay? Because it strikes me that that's the Hebrew term that you used, and that is, that also Maimonides uses is dveikut, is
yeah,
adhering, right?
yeah,
And that's when the moment when I shift from I'm aware to I'm aware of an awareness that extends beyond myself. I look out of the cave into the ocean. That's a moment when I might say I'm touching into Dveku. I'm aware
yeah,
of the connection.
yeah, exactly. And then, there can be an experience of merging with the ocean as well, or any sense of being someone over here witnessing the ocean, from the side,
Hmm.
separate kind of observer where that dissolves too,
Yeah.
Um,
What about the loving nature, Sam? Because the text doesn't touch on that so much.
yeah, I was saying that, in the Hasidic tradition and the Jewish mystical tradition, right, God is conceived as or understood as being a field of infinite consciousness, not a being,
Hmm.
right? But we might say the ground of being itself. And that the stuff out of which God is made is pure, infinite love. Um, so you might notice, for example, how when you observe the breath or thoughts or whatever, right, awareness is very open, it's very spacious, and it's embracing, everything can move through it, right? So according to the mystics, that's an expression of that divine love. It's not sentimental love, because sentimental love is always finite, right? And dependent on causes and conditions. It's actually indiscriminate, infinite, unconditional love. In the sense of absolute acceptance, absolute openness.
Mhm. And it's as distinguished from sentimental, which would be
Finite
Mhm.
and bound up with our finite emotional and embodied life.
Right. So in terms of the themes of the high holidays we're talking about now, this is good because, there is a shift from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, where in the rabbinic tradition, God shifts from the throne of judgment to the throne of compassion, right? There's a
Yeah.
movement, right? So maybe you can say a few words about, given what you've said and given what our practice has been today, how can we understand judgment, and,
Yeah. Great. So it's a very anthropomorphic term that the rabbis use, right?
right?
That God is a king sitting on a throne and God's sitting on the throne of judgment, judging people and rendering, decrees and rulings and so on and so forth. And some people, end up innocent. Some people end up guilty, and the guilty parties get punished and so on and so forth. And we're trying to encourage God to get up from that throne and sit on the throne of mercy or compassion. It's very anthropomorphic, right? But in the mystical approach, right, judgment is actually associated with symptom, with contraction, right? With that water entering into the cave, right, and taking on the dimensions, the finite dimensions of the cave, or at least it looks like, right, it's taking on the finite dimensions of the cave. And that's where we experience contraction, constriction, tightness, right? So there's a way in which we can look upon the things that we did over the course of the year that were harmful to ourselves and others, and we can really hold those with a sense of constriction and contraction. The heart can really kind of contract, and shifting the divine to the seat of compassion in this mystical non-dual idiom would mean that we actually step out of the perspective of the waters in the cave, right, and step into the perspective of the ocean itself, right, which is absolute infinite love and compassion, and understands deeply that any harm we have committed, right, was out of a sense of being a separate sense of a separate self, right? We were trying to protect ourselves or guard ourselves or defend ourselves or, satisfy our desires or have our needs met, right, as an individual separate self, and with the eyes of absolute compassion that we adopt, as it were, when we step into the perspective of the ocean, right, we can see the real reason behind all of that, right? Mm-hmm. Which is that we were trying to be happy, right? We were trying to avoid suffering, and from there we can then hold everything that we did with so much depth of wisdom and compassion that can then really illuminate for us how we want to be in the future in a way that will be less, we might say, self-centered, or that instead of being completely caught up in the subject-object divide, right, can be informed by this sense of oneness and non-separation.
Yeah. There's a paragraph after that part of Unatana Tokef that you excerpt. There's a paragraph that I think that's after it. I'm not even sure if it's part of the same prayer, but it's liturgically used the same way, where there's this juxtaposition in that passage that you shared of, we're finite basically, and God, you're infinite, right? But then there's a line that says, your name befits you, and your name is infinite, and you've connected your name with our name,
right?
Which is really, ties it together at the end in a very powerful way, which is to say, like you said, like, I'm just a cave. I'm just a cave. You're the ocean, right? But there's this moment of, wow, and I'm a cave that gets to be filled with the ocean,
Yeah.
All these caves, all of our caves are connected to this, as you put it, limitless, loving ocean that is able to hold us regardless of where we are. And I just like, I wanted to get the punchline in there.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I also just want to say one more thing, and I realize we're coming up on time here, but I really do want to encourage people to look at Rabbi Rachel Barenblatt's
Oh, yes.
which we didn't get to today. She really builds on this idea of each of us being a window through which God looks upon the world and experiences the world, right?
Why don't you read it, Sam? We could probably do it in a minute.
Okay, great.
Reading
Natalie, do you want to pull it up real quickly?
You have it handy, Natalie? It's so good.
It'd also really be nice to get a woman's voice here as well.
Right.
So this was, I think, given out on day 20 of the Omer, or she composed it for the 20th day of the Omer, but it's really called Windows on the World. Imagine a house where every window shows a different world. This one reveals the root system of an ancient tree. This one, a mother rocking her infant back down to sleep. A young man balances a pallet of green coconuts on his head. A child offers boxes of chiclets to stopped cars. Here, a field where corn sprouts emerge chartreuse. A violinist busks in a tiled subway station and strangers applaud. A man squeezes pomegranates by hand, sells their frothy juice. Gnarled olive trees overlook a pitted wall built by giants. The house is God's, and we are its windows. Wash away dirt, become transparent. Look, such beauty shines through you.
A great one.
A way to convey the teaching.
Yeah. Okay, Sam. Thank you so much, my friend. It was wonderful.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone who came today and for your dedication to practice.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Natalie, for holding us. Thanks, Ruth, for sponsoring today's practice. And